wanted to briefly run through this article I put together on Steemit called The Fantastic Properties of Nanobubbles. Originally, this first section was put together by Kaneo Chiba and Masayoshi Takahashi. Ordinary bubbles rise to the surface quickly. Microbubbles rise to the surface a little bit more slowly. They can also dissipate before rising to the surface. Nanobubbles can remain. They produce their nanobubbles by forcing air through a carbon-based air stone, which produces microbubbles. They then shake the air stone at a high frequency, which then collapses the microbubble, and there's ions exchanged between the heat emitted by the collapsing bubble with the electrolytes and the salts in the water, which then the nanobubbles become negatively charged and remain in the water. Example of their generator. Which can also be the Venturi effect. Relative size difference between microbubble and nanobubble. Note that much of the same gases are still in that tiny bubble, but they've been compressed. Again, nanobubbles can remain in water for months as a dissolved gas, depending upon what gas you use. Could be dissolved oxygen, dissolved hydrogen. And they have all these different tests. And this is just a quick run through. So normal ozone systems that bubble through water with dissolved ozone, the ozone doesn't remain for long periods. So you must water your plants or do your laundry with the ozone water before the bubbles dissipate. But the nanobubbles can remain, again, for months and still have a large content. Ozone nanobubbles can be used to treat the norovirus. By soaking them in ozone nanobubble water for simply 24 hours, you could turn a nasty sample from this into something like this. That's pretty impressive to me. And I was hoping that the nanobubbles remain when you reduce water to a mist or a fog. I think that means that 80% of the oxygen nanobubbles that were in the reservoir of water still remained in the collected mist. Sea life loves oxygen. And an orchid, like a Phalaenopsis orchid, you're only supposed to water every so often and keep it damp. But here you see the entire root system is fully submerged in the water, and there are fish in the water also for more than a month, because there is so much dissolved oxygen in the water that the roots can absorb no problem. They're not drowning because there's a sufficient supply of oxygen. Works very well for plant growth. And I'm also wondering what hydrogen water and HHO water might do, and other combinations. That's interesting, is that they froze a bunch of oysters in ozone, might have been oxygen water actually here. And they still remained alive after thawing them out. Little Encino oysters. Hey. Apparently, I think drinking this type of water helps to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke by cleaning out the arteries of plaque safely, I'd hope. Doesn't leave big old chips just going through your system. Another interesting one is the vagus nerve of a rat, which is like the spinal cord leading from the brain down to the spine, the main cortex. And you see a lot more cellular activity. You see more like symplasts and rouleaus, stacked red blood cells that don't have individuality. And you can have freshwater and saltwater fish in the same tank. You have a YouTube video about the amazing properties of nano-bubble water, showing the freshwater and saltwater fish. Check that video out. Here is a video of purifying an entire pond or a lake. It was either a muck or algae bloom, and they pumped oxygen nanobubbles into the water, which sank to the bottom and interacted with all of the dissolved impurities, rose them to the surface to form a muck, which was then skimmed off of the surface to leave the rest of the body of water pristine. And within hours or even within one day, that's extremely impressive. I'm sure that could be helping with potential algae bloom problems and other murky wowdas. Okay. Same thing with more examples over and over of the nanobubble water oxygen cleaning out tanks and possibly make it so you don't have to have chlorine and chemicals in a stagnant vat, like a rain collecting vat. Pump nano oxygen bubbles in it. Perhaps you can have it remain stagnant like the orchid example. In these videos, it describes the carbon-based air stone that's made of wood that's burned in a pyrolytic oven. And then they force air through it. Then they place that in front of a jet stream underwater, which blows the bubbles off of the surface and collapses them. And you can see a laser beam with the backscatter if you shine it through the water, since nanobubbles are invisible to the naked eye. Mesopores. And apparently this man, Otto Warburg, speculated that cancer spreads from the body fermenting glucose at a faster rate than it absorbs oxygen. So perhaps if we can drink nanobubble oxygen water and help saturate our cells at a greater rate than breathing 21% oxygen per breath, it might help to prevent cancers, or if at a high enough saturation might even promote remission. It's again an example of microbubbles and nanobubbles side by side. The microbubbles are like the bubbles you would find in your tap water if you turn it on and it gets cloudy but then dissipates quickly. That's just normal air, microbubbles. But if you had pure oxygen and then collapsed those microbubbles further, they'd be reduced to nanobubbles and remain. But they would only remain if it's stagnant, and if there is a shock, the nanobubbles revert back to microbubbles and are lost. Probably takes just a little bit more energy to create the shock wave equal to the amount of energy it took to generate the bubble. And in this example, he has that carbon-based air stone attached to a can of pure oxygen, attached to a regulator so it doesn't blow out the air stone. And he has that attached to an electric toothbrush. And he's vibrating the air stone, shaking it back and forth so that the microbubbles form into nanobubbles. And then he's testing the dissolved oxygen content. And other examples. So you can go through this Steemit article called Amazing Properties, Fantastic Properties of Nanobubbles. I compiled all of this information together, speculating this and that. Could you use an extremely flammable gas as nanobubble dissolved gas in water, and then render that water into a mist or a fog and then ignite it like a fuel? Do that with ammonia or magna gas. It's like pulse detonation engines, scramjets, hypersonic engines that use very volatile gases and compression chambers and all that. Even in the medical industry, they seek materials like graphene, which have these tiny pores which can help synthesize DNA and RNA and administer evenly sized droplets for inhalers and other medicines. And Gerald Pollack's work and how it relates to the negative charge of the nanobubbles. Victor Schauberger's work, this repulsine engine, the analogy of the movie The Abyss with the amniotic fluid that was oxygen saturated and allowed the man to breathe underwater, so to speak. Things about Mark Leclerc and his cavitation experiments generating radiation. Mark Griggs' hydrosonic pump. Graphene. And all sorts of cool stuff. So please check out this Steemit article and help spread the free information.